Imagine building a payment solution that works seamlessly across web, iOS, and Android with one code base, including the backend logic required to handle payments. Today, I'll show you how to integrate Stripe into your Expo app, including support for Apple Pay and backend routes powered by Expo API routes. Ready to take your payments to the next level? Let's dive in. Before we begin, you'll need an Expo account, an Apple developer account for deploying your app and enabling Apple Pay, and a Stripe account. This video won't cover hosting your API routes, but if that's something that you would like, drop a comment below and I'll create a follow-up video showing how to deploy them. As I mentioned before, we're gonna need an Expo account. So I already have mine here, and as you can see, I have some projects. We're also gonna need a Stripe account, and if you don't have one, you're gonna need to create one. You can go to stripe.com and create one. So this is mine, and it is in test mode, which is good for development. Just for reference, I want to show that I'm gonna be following a little bit this guide on the Stripe docs about how to accept a payment using React Native. And we also have an Expo document showing instructions on how to install the Stripe React Native SDK. And finally, at the end, I have my Apple developer account as well. We're going to need this because we're going to need permissions from Apple and also the certificates if you want to publish your application. But if you want to accept Apple Pay in your application, you're going to need to have an extra configuration in your certificates. We're not going to be handling that manually. That is going to be handled automatically by EAS Build, but still you need to have the account. So once you have these accounts, we can go ahead and start creating our application. So the first thing that I'll do is just go ahead and run this command to create a new Expo application, and the name is going to be Full Stack Stripe App, and I'm going to be using Bun for my package manager. So let's go ahead and hit enter. All right, and the app is ready. So let's go ahead and cd into the folder, Full Stack Stripe App. Next, let's open this in VS Code or Cursor, whatever you are using. So I'm going to be using Cursor for this. So I'll say cursor dot, and this is going to open my app. Okay, so here we have our application, and the first thing that I'll do is just open the package.json and install the Stripe dependencies. Now, because this is going to be a full stack application, we're going to be handling the API routes within the app folder, and also we want support for web as well as native. So let's go ahead and install these dependencies: Stripe, React Stripe.js, as well as Stripe.js and Stripe React Native. So I'll just go ahead and hit enter, and the dependencies are installed, and you can verify that in your package.json. As you can see here, this tree, and if I scroll down, we have Stripe in here. All right, so now that we have these dependencies installed in our application, I need to go to my app.json and make some configurations. First of all, I'll change the scheme of my application to be full stack Stripe app, which is basically the slug and the name of my application. The scheme, by the way, is used to link to your application. So make sure that you have like the name of your app or something meaningful. Now let's scroll down all the way where the plugins are. So we have the Expo splash screen and the Expo Router as well. So after Expo Router, I'll create a new plugin, and this plugin, it's going to be for Stripe, and this is how it looks. So this plugin, it's going to take some data in here. That's why I'm specifying this object, and the data is going to be the merchant identifier. This is only for iOS, and this is if you are going to accept Apple Pay. So in this case, we want to accept Apple Pay apart from the cards and all the payments that come by default. With Stripe, we want support Apple Pay for iOS. So let's go ahead and specify the merchant. So in this case, because we're using EAS Build to handle the build and the certificates for us, we simply need to specify it here. But if you are not using EAS Build, you will need to configure this manually with Apple. After that, I'll add my publishable key. So this is my Stripe publishable key, and this is a key that is public. It's included in the client, which means you don't really need to hide it unless you really want to, but I'll just go ahead and paste it in here. And just to show you where you can get this key, you can get it by just going to your Stripe dashboard and just type key, and you'll find these API keys for developers. And this is my publishable key. So you can just click in here and copy it, and then go back in here and paste it in here. Okay, so I'll close the terminal for now. We need to do one more thing. In the Expo Router section, I wrapped Expo Router in an array because I want to specify some options. And the option that I want to specify is going to be the origin. And this origin is used for the API routes. So if I just press tab in here, this is basically like the domain of your application. So in this case, I'm going to be deploying this application, and the name that I'll be using is going to be full stack Stripe app. And maybe I can add some dash in here, but instead of using .com, of course, if you are using like, your app.com, you go ahead and use it in here. But in this case, mine is going to be expo.app. This origin is used so that when we are referring to API routes in our code, we don't need to specify the origin. We can just specify the route. And to be more clear, let's go quickly to the layout. And what I'm saying is that instead of saying fetch and then add the entire link, as you can see there, because we're adding that origin, we can just say fetch and then pass the route, which is more cleaner. Okay, so hope that makes sense. All right, so let's go ahead and hit save in our app.json. And the next thing that I'll do is create a new file for my environment variables. So in this case, the publishable key, we don't really care about showing it to everyone, but we're going to need as well our secret key. And the secret key, it's actually very sensitive. You need to be very careful with this. So let's go ahead and create this environment file. And if you haven't already, just go ahead and add it to your git ignore. So after this, I will say .env so that GitHub doesn't track this end file. Okay, so same thing. If we go back to the website in here, you can find the secret key. So you need to press this reveal key, then copy the key and come here and paste it in here, okay? Okay, so I have added my secret key, my publishable key, and also my merchant identifier. Now the next thing that I want to do is actually register my application with Apple so that this merchant identifier will work. So the way we do that using EAS is just by simply building the application. So I'll just open my terminal and run the command EAS Build Platform iOS. So if you don't have the EAS CLI installed, you can simply run npm install globally EAS CLI, and this is going to install it. I already have it installed, so I can just simply say EAS Build Platform iOS. So I don't have anything else, just that. I haven't even run the application, but let's just go ahead and run this command. So I'll just hit enter. The CLI is going to handle everything for me. So it's asking me if I want to create an EAS project. So I'll just go ahead and say yes. This is creating the project on expo.dev. And we can confirm by going to the dashboard on Expo and reload. Now I have it in here. This is a full stack Stripe app. Just like that, we created it through the CLI. Okay, now it's asking me for my bundle identifier. So I'll just use the default, which is com beto@expo.fullstackstripeapp. So I'll just go ahead and hit enter. And it's asking me if I want to log in with my Apple developer account. So as I mentioned before, you need to have an Apple developer account. So I'll go ahead and say yes and use my credentials. So this is my Apple ID. And I already inserted my password previously, but if you haven't already, just go ahead and insert your password. Now it's asking me which account I want to use. I'll use Code with Beto. Okay, and EAS is handle everything for me. And it's asking me to reutilize my distribution certificate. I would say yes, and you should select yes as well. So let's go ahead and select yes if you already have one. Then it's asking me if I want to generate a new Apple provisional profile. So I'll go ahead and say yes. I want to create a new provisional profile for this application. Okay, so now this is handled everything, all the credentials, and even started the build for this application. But the cool thing about this is that if we go to my application, this is actually building, and I can cancel this build because this is, I just wanted to generate the credentials, so I can cancel this build here. But the important thing here is that if you go to the configuration and scroll down a little bit, you'll find this credentials section. And if you click on the iOS bundle identifier, you're going to see that we have this distribution certificate, this provisional profile, And on top of that, you can double confirm if you go to the Apple developer account and you go to the identifiers. And here I have a bunch of identifiers, but I'll just go ahead and reload and search for Stripe app, which is the full stack app that I have in here. And if I select the certificate from Apple and scroll down, you're gonna see that we have Apple Pay payment processing already enabled and with the configuration that we need. And if I press on edit just to see what's inside this, you can see that this is my merchant identifier, which is merchant.com.fullstack Stripe app. Okay, so I'll just go ahead and close that. I just wanted to show that because I think it's very important to know what's happening. Although EAS, it's handled everything for you. Okay, so let's go back to the code. Okay, so the build is canceled. That was expected. So let me close the terminal. And just to double confirm, this is the same merchant.com full stack Stripe app that we saw on the Apple developer account. And one more thing that I almost forget in the app.json, guys, we have to go to the web section and change this static output because we're going to be using API routes. You can see that server outputs static HTML and API routes from hosting for hosting with custom Node.js server defaults to single. So let's go ahead and change this to server and hit save. Now, a couple things to notice is that after I triggered the build with EAS, the EAS JSON file was generated with the development, preview, and production profiles. Okay, so nothing is required in here yet, so I'll just close that. And another thing is that this extra field was created automatically when we run this on EAS Build. So the only thing that was added was the origin of my application and my project ID for EAS. Okay, so now I'll just go ahead and close this and close everything. And I think we are good to start developing our application. So let's pre-build the application. I'll say npx expo pre-build and hit enter. This is going to generate my Android and iOS folders. Now, because I'm using EAS Build, I'll just go ahead and add that to my git ignore. So I'll add this iOS and Android folder, hit save, because these folders are auto-generated by EAS. So we don't need to commit them to GitHub. Okay, so let's run this on iOS by saying npx expo run iOS. Okay, and now notice a couple things. It's loading the environment file as well with the with the variables that I set, like my secret key as well as my publishable key. All right, so while this is building, I think it's time for us to start developing the UI of our application. So my idea for this app was to have just a screen that is going to allow users to donate money. And this is a good way to get paid, right? We can accept donations, but if you have a product, you can just go ahead and display the product. The logic is going to be the same thing. So for this, actually my idea was to install this slider from CallStack. And this slider is going to allow me to increase the amount that I want to donate. So let's go ahead and copy this and let's go back to our code. And once this is done, I can install this dependency. All right, and the app is ready. So let's go ahead and open it. And we should be able to see the hello world screen. Okay, and it's working. Awesome, that is great. So I'll just go ahead and stop this again and say bun install and install this slider library that I want to use. So let's go ahead and hit enter. Just to make sure that everything is going to work, I'll pre-build my application again by saying npx expo pre-build and then run on iOS. So this is going to start installing dependencies again. In the meantime, I want to go here and just copy the example. So we need to import slider. So let's go ahead and copy this and go back to the layout. So in the layout, we have the tabs and inside the tabs, we have the index. So let's go ahead and work in this screen. So I'll paste the slider in here and cut this and paste it inside this view. Okay, and the app is working and I can see my slider. Yep, so it kind of works. I think I can just go ahead and remove those colors. And now we have this nice blue. color. And now the only thing that I want to do is create a state variable in here, and cursor is helping me. So this is great. So let's call this one donation amount. And this is going to be using use state. So let's say react.use state, and I'll import react like this. I'll paste it at the top. Cool. So this is a number. We can come here and change this. Okay. And the maximum value is going to be, let's say $100, right? And of course, I need to somehow display the value of this. So let's say your donation amount, it's this amount. Maybe a bit smaller like this. Cool. So if I start swiping this, yeah, maximum $100. But yeah, let's get rid of the decimals. So I can say math dot floor and floor this value. Okay, let's see. Okay, and I can start, yeah, dragging, and we have the amount. So now we can start getting paid for our application. Now I'll set the width to 100%, and the height, I think 40 is fine for now. Let's go ahead and remove these views that we don't really need. All right, so I think it's working fine. Now I'll just go ahead down and create a button down here. And this button is going to come from React Native. And the title is going to be donate. And then we're calling this handle donate. So this function is not created yet. So for now, I'll just have an empty function. But yeah, this is my application, and we are ready to start getting paid. So the first thing that we need to do when we're using Stripe is wrap our application using the Stripe provider. But there's a caveat in our case, because we need to handle not only native but as well web. So in our case, we're gonna need to create a provider for web and another provider for native. So in my components, I'll create a new file, and the name of this file is going to be stripe provider.tsx. And in here, I'll say export default function stripe provider. Now we're going to need to return the Stripe provider, and we can import this Stripe provider from Stripe React Native. And of course, we have a conflict because I call this one the same name as the one that I'm importing here. So I'll just add Expo Stripe provider. Now it's warning me that this requires some properties. So let's say publishable key equal to something. We need to also specify the merchant identifier and a URL scheme. Now, since I won't have anything inside this provider, I can just self-close it like that and say that this is going to get some properties. So inside here, I'll add the properties, and the type, it's as follows. Basically, this is going to be type of Stripe provider. Now, finally, we can pass the properties in here using the 3-dot spread syntax. All right, so this is our provider for native. Now we need to pass these values somehow, right? So to grab these values, I'm going to be using constants from Expo Constants, and this is a library that comes with the template, as you can see here. It's already installed, and if you don't have it, you should install it. So constants allows us to get values from the app config, for example. So we can grab from that the merchant ID. So I'll grab the merchant ID in here using the constants expo config, accessing the plugins, and then we are finding the Stripe with React Native. And from there, we are grabbing the merchant identifier. Just to make sure that we are on the same page, basically we are accessing this field and grabbing the merchant identifier. Okay, so if you don't have a merchant identifier, we are throwing an error saying that we don't have a merchant identifier. With that, we can come here and first of all, grab this from the process.env expo public stripe publishable key. Since this value, I know that is going to be there, I'm going to add this exclamation point as well as the merchant ID that I'm getting from the constants up here. So for the URL scheme, I'm going to be importing all as linking from Expo linking. And Expo linking, it's a library that it's already installed in the template as well. And we can double check that by going to the package JSON. Okay, there it is, version 7. This library is mainly used for linking to our application. And it has some really cool methods, like for example, linking.createURL, and then I'll say split. So createURL, it's a helper method for constructing a div link into our application. And the cool thing about this is that it's going to be changing depending on the environment. So development builds is going to use the scheme, and for web, it's going to use basically the link, right? All right, so I think we're ready to start using this Stripe provider. Let's go to our entry point and I'll say Stripe provider. Let's close it and let's come here and import Expo. It's going to be from Expo Stripe provider, but the name is going to be Stripe provider, like that. Okay, so let's hit save. Okay, so the next thing that I want to do is actually create our API routes, because we need those API routes to be able to start the payment process. And you can double check that by going to the website on the Stripe documentation. If we scroll a bit, you can see that we need to set up Stripe. In this case, we have a server-side piece of logic that we need to handle. And actually this Stripe dependency is for the backend only. And then on the client side, we need to use React Native. Okay, so let's start creating our APIs. So I'll create a new file called API, and inside this file, I'm going to create my first route. We are focusing right now on native, so let's create a route that allows us to start the payment form that comes in the Stripe package. So I'll create an API route called payment sheet. And because this is an API, I have to say plus API.ts. And now inside this folder, or inside this API folder, we can write backend code. So we need to initialize Stripe. And for that, I'll go ahead and create a new utility function. And I'm going to create this file in the root of my project. I'm going to call this file Stripe server, and this file is going to be used just for instantiating the Stripe class. So I'll say import Stripe from Stripe, and then I can re-export this instance. Okay, and this is how it looks. On top of that, we can specify the app info. So my app, it's going to be full stack Stripe app, right? And that's it. That's all I want to do in here. Now we can close this file and come back in here and import that Stripe that we just created from Stripe server. So when you are creating a routes using Expo Router, it's actually very similar to Next.js, which is what is suggesting right here, the AI. So I'll say export async function, and this is going to handle a post request. So let's type this request with the native request type. So we can just type in here. Now, when handling payments with Stripe, you might need to create a customer or utilize the same customer if you have one already. So in this case, I'll create a new customer when we call this API. So I can say Stripe await customers.create. And for one-time payments, we need to create an ephemeral key. So this ephemeral key is going to look something like this. And basically this is just creating a short-lived API key for a given resource. So once we have this, we can create a payment intent. And here we have it. So this is a payment intent. We can call Stripe payments.create, and we can pass the amount, the currency, and the customer. You can also pass these automatic payment methods, but I believe that this is not required because Stripe adds this by default. But just to be safe, I'll add these 3 lines in here. Now, in this case, I'm hard coding the amount. So let's grab that from the request. And then down here, I can replace this for the amount that we are getting in here. Maybe I can add an extra validation in here. So I'll floor this. Then if we don't have a amount, I'll just default this to 10. And by the way, the amounts in Stripe are in cents, which means 1,000 cents, it's $1. And that's why we need to multiply this by 100 because we are not sending cents, right, on the request. So if I want $10, I can just add a 0 in here and that should do it. Okay, so that's going to be the default if we don't send anything. And once we have create the payment intent, we can return the response, and the response is going to look something like this. We're going to send the payment intent to the client with the client secret so that the client can use this client secret to proceed with the payment. We're going to send the ephemeral key, the customer ID, and the publishable key. You can add more stuff in here if you need to, but so far I think this should be good. All right, so now we can use this payment sheet API to create the payment intent, and then we can use this payment intent to invoke the sheet from Stripe and pay the money. So let's go to the index. Now, so far I have this button. I'll go ahead and create a new component. So in my folder components, I'll create a new file called checkout.form.native.tsx. You'll see why I'm calling this native for now. Basically, the reason is that I'm going to create the same component for web, but it's going to have different logic. So what I can do here is just basically grab this button that I had in here and say export default function checkout form, and in here I'll return my button. So let's import this from React Native. Let's pass the amount on the properties of this form, and now we can start using the use Stripe hook to initialize the payment sheet. So I'll import this from React Native, and then I'll also create a loading variable using React. So let's import this from React. So what we need to do here to initialize the payment sheet is actually hit our API to get a payment intent. So for that, I'll create a function that is going to be doing this fetch request to our own API. So the payment sheet API that we just created, this is how we can reference it. And then we pass a method, which is a post request, and the content type is going to be JSON. At the end, we are just returning the response. So we can use this function to initialize the payment sheet. So for that, I'll create a function inside this component. This function looks like this. It's called initialize payment sheet. And basically we are calling the fetch payment sheet params, which is this fetch request. And if you remember, this response should return the payment intent, the ephemeral key, and the customer. So then we can call this init payment sheet that is coming from the use Stripe hook, then passing the merchant display name. In this case, we are saying Expo Inc. We're passing the customer ID, the customer ephemeral key secret, as well as the payment intent secret. So in this case, we are setting the allow delay payment method to true if your business can handle payment methods that complete payment after a delay. So I'll say yes. Then also default billing details. You can specify these, or you can request the user to enter these details if you need them to. And then we also need a return URL. So for that, we're going to be using linking. So let's import that from Expo linking, and we are creating a URL with this Stripe redirect. Finally, because we want to handle Apple Pay as well, we need to set this property Apple Pay and then passing the merchant country code. So in this case, I'm in the US, and if we don't have an error, we are going to start loading. So we're setting loading equal to true. And by the way, one thing that I'm forgetting is that we need to pass the amount in the post, right? So let's say amount equal to number, and then we can pass the amount in the body of this fetch request so that we can get this amount in here, remember? So let's go back in here. Okay, so let's pass this in here, and the amount is coming from the properties, if you remember. After this, I will create a new function, and this function is going to be in charge of basically presenting the payment sheet using the present payment sheet. And this is coming from the use Stripe hook as well. And we need to import alert from React Native. So let's import that. So now I'll rename this to initialize payment. And usually you want to initialize the payment as soon as the component mounts, or as soon as the user travels to the product that they want to buy. You should create like a payment intent with the amount that they want to pay. But in this case, because I'm going to be dragging the slider, I'm not sure if that's a good idea to being, calling this initialize every time that we mount this component. So what I'll do is that I'll call this initialize payment intent, and then maybe I can have two buttons. One for initializing the payment intent once we have the amount, and then one for open the payment sheet. Okay, so let's hit save. Let's go back to the index, and in here I'll call my checkout form. Let's import this from my form. After importing, guys, you need to restart the server just to make sure that everything is working and being loaded fine, including the API routes. And yeah, so let's just go ahead and reload the application. I'll run init payment. This is hitting the API, as you can see in the logs. And I have some warnings. I'll just ignore them for now, and I'll press open payment sheet. Now, I forgot to change the the donation amount. Right now it's 0. Actually, we should have a validation for that, but as you can see, this is working in test mode. The reason why is test mode is because if you remember, we are using our test keys, and of course in a production environment you would want to use your production keys. And once you do that, once you switch these keys, by the way, you can switch them automatically based on the environment of your application. But once you switch that, you shouldn't be able to see the test mode. Another thing to notice is that we have the Apple Pay button enabled. So let me cancel this. What I'll do now is move this a little bit, close these warnings, clear the terminal, and let's increase the donation to be, let's say, what, $50? And before I initialize the payment again, I want to show you that here I have my Stripe account and I don't have any transactions. So today 0, this is my test environment. So if I come back and initialize a new payment intent, so that's done. And if I press again, open payment sheet, and now let's try to pay with Apple Pay. Okay, so it's asking for my information. So I created like a credential that is fake in my simulator with random data just for testing. So you need to enter your address and payment method. But in this case, as you can see, it's 50.54 and it looks like I'm not rounding the final price, but that's fine. I'll just go ahead and pay with passcode. Just wanted to mention or show that the slider is working, but every time that the user or the price changes on your application, you need to create a new payment intent or update the current one. And we also see this alert that says success, your order is confirmed. This is the behavior in native. Usually on web, we redirect a user to a result route. And in this result route, we load the payment intent and we checked if it was successful. But in native, we can just go to the checkout form.native. And if you remember, we created this alert that is the one that we are seeing right now on screen. So I'll just press OK. Let's go back to the Stripe dashboard. And now I have a payment of $50. Let's do another one. I'll do maybe like, $2. Let's initialize the payment intent, because if I don't do that, I can press open payment intent again and nothing is going to happen. So we need to have a payment intent. So I'll press again payment intent. And then open the payment sheet, and now this time it's going to work. We can pay with a card, but I'm too lazy for that, and since we already enabled Apple Pay, I can pay these $2 here super quickly. All right, and after a second, if I come back, now we have $52 in revenue. How cool is that? So this is working great. Now, before I jumped into doing this on web, I want to double check that this is working on Android. So let's run the app on Android. So I'll say npx expo Prebuild platform. It's going to be Android in this case. Let me now move this in here. And finally, npx expo run Android. Now let's wait for a second until the build is done. And the build is ready. And I have that in my other desktop. So here's my Android emulator. Okay, so I'll add another $50 and I'll press initiate payment. Once we have done that, we can open the payment sheet. And this is how it looks on Android. So for Android, we don't have Apple Pay. Of course, that's only for iOS. But in this case, we can test the functionality of this using the Stripe test cards. And you can learn more about the test cards in the Stripe documentation. But the one that you are going to be using the most is going to be the 42, 42, 42. And for the month and year, you can set any values as long as the values are, the date is valid. So in this case, I'm saying 25. That's a year. And for the zip code, you can press as well. You can set any value in here. And yeah, so in this case, as you can see, we have the Expo Inc. So, and we can save this payment intent for Expo Inc., which is technically our company in this case. And yeah, so the phone number is optional. I'll just go ahead and pay this $50. And after a moment, the transaction is successful on Android as well. And on the left, now we have $103. So that's super cool. And yeah, this is working on Android. Now let's make this work on web. Okay, so back to the code. What I'll do now is just switch this iPhone for a web view, since now we are focusing on web. All right, so here I have my web view, and the next thing that I'll do is just press W on my terminal to run this on web. Okay, so I'll open this on my web browser. And the first thing that we encounter is that we have an error. All right, and this error, guys, it's actually coming because we're trying to access web functionality, native functionality in web. And the place where we are doing that is in the Stripe provider. So Stripe provider, it's implementing the React native Stripe, right? And this is only for native. It has native implementation for iOS and Android. So we need to do something similar for web. That's why this is breaking. So I'll create a new file in my components and I'll name it the same. I'll say Stripe provider.tsx. The only difference is that I'll add a .web. So now it's .web.tsx. And what I'm doing, writing this .web, it's basically telling the website that please don't use this Stripe provider that we already have in here for native, because this is for native and this is going to break the website. Instead, use the same file, but the .web instance. And by the way, the .web instance is going to be very different from the native. In fact, we don't need to have any of the same logic. What I'll do in this case is just export default an Expo Stripe provider, which is the same name that we have for native. Just to confirm, this is the name. And I'm passing the props, and the props is going to just render the children. So we are not doing anything for web, just exporting this component so that we don't get this error. So I'll save and let's restart the server again. I'll say npx expo start. And on my website, I'll reload. Okay, so after refreshing, as you can see, now I have a new error. And now the error, it's different. The error is complaining about this component checkout form. Now, if you remember as well, when we created the checkout form, we added the .native.tsx extension. And this means that this component is only going to work for native, which means in the index screen where we are using this component checkout form, although I'm not saying that import this from .native, we shouldn't do that. Basically, it's complaining on web because this doesn't have an implementation. So let's go ahead and duplicate the checkout form. So I'll copy paste, and for the copy, I'll switch. We could say web, or we can simply leave it as it is. So in this case, we can say checkout form since we are specifying the other one for native only. So in the checkout form for web, we cannot use React Native Stripe. So let's delete this. We are not going to be using LinkedIn as well for now, so I'll just leave the alert and button. Now for web, instead of handling the payment inside the application, we're going to be using a Stripe checkout session, which is like an external website that handles the payment for us. So in that case, we won't be needing this function to fetch the payment intent. Instead, we need to create a new checkout session. And to create this checkout session, I'll create a new function, which is going to be called open payment modal. And in this case, we need to hit a different API for web, which is going to initiate the checkout session. So we need to create this API route. And in this case, I'm passing the donation in the headers. So let's pass the amount that we're going to be getting in here. And then, like I mentioned before, we're going to be taking the user to a different web page. That's why we're pushing to this URL. So let's import router from Expo Router. Okay, so this is our little open payment modal function. It's very simple, just hitting this API that is going to create the checkout session, passing the donation, and then we're opening the URL. I'll minimize this function. So inside the checkout form, we are not gonna be using Stripe anymore. Let's go ahead and delete this implementation and let's just leave this return. So in this case, we could rename this to be just checkout. And when we press the button, we're going to call our function passing the amount that we are getting in this property. So let's go ahead and hit save. Let's clear this. Let's reload the website. And now the website, it's working. The reason why it's working is because now we have this implementation for web and native, right? And we can also set the slider with different amounts. Cool, so now let's handle this API. I'll copy this route plus api.ts. Okay, so first thing, we import Stripe from Stripe server, which is our file to instantiate Stripe. Once we have that, let's handle this post request. This is going to be a post request. So first of all, remember that we are passing the donation. So I'll say custom donation, and I'm grabbing these from the headers. So I'll say get custom donation. Let's grab the origin as well from the headers. So I'll get the origin. And with that, we can create a checkout session. So I'll say session equal to await Stripe checkout session.create. And this is going to get a bunch of options, and you can learn more in the Stripe docs. First of all, mode, it's going to be payment. Submit type, in my case, it's going to be donate, but you can say pay, subscribe, book, auto. So in this case, it's donate. Then let's pass the items. This is an array. First item, we need the quantity. In this case, it's 1. And let's pass the price data. We need to specify the currency, in this case, USD. Product data as well. In this case, we can pass the name. We can also set a description. Now, in this case, I'm getting a warning here because this is expecting a number and this is a string, I think. So for this, let's use this helper function that I have here. I'll put it at the end of this. And this helper function is just going to take a amount and it's going to change the format to satisfy the Stripe format. So for this one, we can pass the amount and currency. And then this is only, grabbing a number or converting the amount to be a number with the currency. This is very helpful, especially if you're handling many currencies. But yeah, at the end of this function, this is just going to return the amount. So in here, I can just replace this and use this function called format. We pass the custom donation and the currency, and I still have a warning. So this is type string or null is not assignable to a type number. So in this case, what I can do is say, maybe call this one amount and then parsing this to be a number. But if we do have a custom donation, right? Otherwise we can pass 0 and then we can use that in here. And that is making, Stripe happy. Let's update this as well. Let me close the terminal for now. And that's it for our item. You can add more items if you want to. I'll just minimize this for now. And after the line items, we can pass a success URL as well as a cancel URL. And we can also specify the UI mode. So in this case, it's going to be hosted. And at the end of this, I'll return this response, which is going to have the session, client secret, and session URL. So if you want, you can return the entire session, but in this case, we only need the client secret and the URL. Now, I'm not going to be creating a route for canceling. So in this case, I will just redirect to the index. But for the success URL, we're going to be creating a new route for that. So this is going to be called result, which means I need to create a route called result in here to handle this. And then we are passing the session ID in the path. Okay, so if we go back to the checkout form, this should work because now this API, it's handled. So just to double check, I'll just come here and press checkout. So this is opening this in the same web page. And if I press back, this is going to take me back. So let's change this to be, let's say 30 and check out. And now I'm paying $30 with 52 cents. Let's change this to be 50, check out. Okay, so I have here fake data. I'm using the test card 4242, just random numbers, random name, random zip code, random country. Let's go ahead and donate. But before I do that, let's see that we have $103. And after I donate, I'll say not. Okay, that worked. This is taking me to the result, as you can see here, result, and then it's passing the session ID. And if I go back here and refresh, we should see now $154. And yeah, so in this case, we are not handling the result page. Let's go ahead and do that. Yeah, let me just leave that as it is for now. The next thing that I'll do is just create a new file called result.tsx to handle this route. Now, a couple things to notice here. When we redirect the user to the result screen, we are going to get the session ID, right? So we need to use this session ID, hit the Stripe API, and ask Stripe for the information about this session ID. And information is going to contain if the payment was successful or if the payment failed. And based on that result, we need to show a UI for the user. So we need an API to handle this request to Stripe. Let's go ahead and create a new API. Let's call it Stripe results plus API.ts. This API is going to look something like this. First of all, I'm importing the type Stripe, and then I'll import my Stripe instance. So with that, this GET request is going to come with the session ID, right? So we are grabbing the session ID from the params, and this is how it looks. So we get the session ID, which means this huge value that you can barely see on the top right of the screen. Then if we don't have a session ID, we throw an error. We're gonna be using the Stripe instance to get this session, right? So to retrieve the session, we call this method, we pass the session ID, and we can also specify where we want to expand the response of this checkout session. So I want to expand on the line items and the payment intent. Once we have that, we simply return it to the client. So let's hit save. Now we have this API, and we can go back to the results screen and handle this logic based on this session ID. So because I don't want to make this video too long, I'll go ahead and paste this logic in here, and I'll explain it to you step by step. This is the result page. We're going to be using the use local search params. This is so that we can get the search params from the link, and we also have a data state variable that is going to hold the session results. Okay, so if we don't have a session in the path, we are going to say, please provide the session. And then we have a use effect, which means as soon as this page loads, we are going to try to fetch or hit our own API, passing the session ID from the search params. Then with the response, we grab the JSON and then we set the data. And that's it. We're gonna re-trigger this fetch every time that the session ID changes. And if we don't have any data, we return loading screen. Once we have data, we can grab the payment intent from the data. And with that, we can display information or do any business logic that you need in here. But this, of course, this page would be just for showing the result to the user. So I wouldn't recommend handle any business logic in this screen, especially because this lives on the client. Instead, you want to handle business logic in using webhooks, but we won't be covering that in this video. Anyways, so once we have the payment intent, you can display the status, which is going to tell the user if the transaction was canceled, succeeded, or processing, or whatever. Okay, then we can just display the entire data. So in this case, we have this print object component, which is only showing the entire response on screen using a pre tag. Because this redirect is only for web, we can use this pre tag, which is a web tag. So let's go ahead and hit save. So let's try to do that again. I'm here in my donation amount screen. Let's donate $100 and check out. Okay, so I have here test info and I'll donate $100. Okay, this is going to take me back to the screen. And if I toggle dark mode, yeah, I'm not handling dark mode, but as you can see, the result was succeeded. The status of the transaction is succeeded, which means everything went well, and we get the entire info in here. And from here, you can take any info that you need to show to the customer or calculate anything. And let's just double check that everything went well. Now, in this case, we have $250, which means it's working great. And that's it. That brings us till the end of this video. We learned how to handle native Stripe payments using the Stripe React Native SDK, as well as we learned how to add functionality for web using the checkout session. We created API routes for both platforms, native and web, and even we created this slider for custom donations. I hope you liked this video, and if you have any questions, please let me know in the comments. If you want me to create a video teaching you how to host your API routes, as well, let me know in the comments and I would create a video in the future. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.